Thank you, Alexander, and hi, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this launch. I think what's important with the informal economy is to realize the complexity and diversity that it entails. Often we talk about we see that the informal economy is talked about in pretty negative terms, in terms of tax avoiding, source of low productivity or low levels of development. We've seen a lot of studies saying that provision of social protection to the informal economy would promote further informality, and that informality is a choice. But in most cases, informal and formal activities are not substitutes, and transition in between is often difficult, if possible at all. And the majority in the informal economy is just trying to find a livelihood in the absence of other options. But these statements tend to promote a negative opinion as well. So we see quite often that we have informal workers being evicted from the working place, goods being confiscated, and harassments from public officials. On the other hand, the informal economy provides valuable services and goods, for instance, to poor people. So when we talk about, for instance, taxation, we need to take in consideration not only the informal workers themselves, but also the subsequent values that they create and the negative effects it can have on, for instance, poor people and households. We also see in recent studies that will show that the informal economy is paying taxes, and in most cases unproportional to incomes. So I think the problem is not the existence of the informal economy as such, but the conditions that force people into informality. And I think we need to address these conditions, and in terms of formalization, have more focus on creating those conditions that will integrate people more into formal frameworks, into development plans, into decent work situations, and so on. And therefore, I welcome this report with its focus on a new social contract. And I also think that the KIBI data set will be able to provide important input to an evidence-based discussion, in particular as it's focused not only on individuals, but also on the household level, so you get a broader context. So I'm looking forward to today's discussions, and thank you. Over to you, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Anders, for this, welcoming words. So the way we'll organize this webinar, I will actually start with my colleague Maria to give a short overview of the report, and then we will have actually the pleasure to welcome our honored panelists who will actually, provide comments and suggestions on the report and the way forward. So let me just, recall that, this report originates from the observation that in recent decades, the process of globalization and rapid technological change, as well as the emergence of new global crises, have challenged social contract throughout the world, while also radically changing the lives of billions of workers, in particular workers in the informal economy that, as you know, constitute the majority of the workforce in the global south. So to date, however, we had, I would say, disparate understanding of how these changes have actually affected informal employment and how fragile social contract might have played a role in mediating this relationship. So this study seeks to enhance our knowledge on those issues. The objective is to better understand, what can be done to support the formalization agenda, what role the opportunities and challenges of globalization and new forms of work can play in that process, and ultimately how enhancing social contract may actually contribute to this agenda. So this work is actually based on the analysis of micro and micro data, including recent ILO individual-based indicators of informality and the OECD key indicators of informality based on individuals and their households. So in what follows, we will speak about the most recent trends of informal employment globally, the linkage between informality and the social contract, as well as the linkages between informality, globalization, and the development of new technologies, in particular digital labor platforms. So the report starts by providing detailed portraits of informality. And I like actually to take the opportunity to thank Florence Bonnet from the ILO for her contribution on this analysis, which shows three important facts. First, prior to the COVID-19 crisis, informal employment was already an outstanding challenge and policy priority for many countries, affecting nearly 2 billion workers, representing close to 60% of the world employed population. So informal employment dominated the global south and ranged from about 20% in Europe and Central Asia to over 90% in several African countries. Second, the COVID crisis had a dramatic impact on informal employment. For the first time ever, the informal economy did not provide a safety net for formal workers, something that it usually provides in a recession period. And at the height of the crisis, informal jobs plunged by 20%, about twice the impact for workers in formal employment. There was also a greater employment loss among informally working women as compared to informally working men, while in contrast, formally working men and women were affected in a similar way. So women in the informal economy were particularly impacted during the crisis. Third point, as the world recovers from the COVID-19 crisis, not only we see a return of informal employment to the pre-crisis level, but also informal employment recovery overtook formal employment recovery. And this is mainly due to three forces. First, we see that many informal workers return actually to their economic activities. Second, because there are also new entrants into informality who were previously outside the labor force, but who need to work to offset losses in household income. And third, informalization of previously formal jobs is taking place. So overall, these results show that the structural deficit of formal job opportunities remain a serious challenge for an inclusive recovery. So how can we understand informality in order to tackle it? This is where the prism of the social contract comes in. And Maria is going to tell more about that, actually.
Yes, greetings to everyone. And thank you very much for being with us here today. And thank you very much also, Alex, for passing the word. So indeed, as we know, and as we have shown also throughout our previous work, informality is a heterogeneous and complex phenomenon, which has many reasons, many causes, and many consequences. And yet, it always happens within an underlying social contract that is in place. Moreover, what we can say is that informality, in a certain sense, reflects the social contract that is in place. So how can we understand it? Well, what is the social contract to start with? The social contract is in itself quite a philosophical idea that dates back to the French philosopher Rousseau. Well, it represents an implicit agreement between various actors, the citizens, the state, the workers, the enterprises, on how to distribute power and resources in order to achieve common goals, such as equity, fairness, freedom, security, and eventually social justice. As you can see on the figure in front of you, social contracts have substantive and procedural dimensions. The substantive dimension pertains to the manner in which common goals are framed and prioritized in a society. The procedural dimension, in its turn, pertains to legal frameworks, institutions, and procedures that help to make this implicit pact explicit. So, as the report shows, the informality can arise in three situations. The first situation is when the procedural dimension is underdeveloped. For example, when the laws of a country do not adapt to the fast-changing realities of the world, when they reflect outdated, for example, colonial legacies in some settings, or where they are not inclusive and do not cover all workers and enterprises. And in those settings, workers simply do not have a choice but to stay informal. There are other situations where the substantive dimension itself is not adequate or is not fully developed. And for example, this can happen when the investments into publicly delivered services such as healthcare and education are low, and these services are of poor quality. And in those settings, some individuals may prefer to opt out of the system. Finally, there is a situation where there is a misalignment between the procedural and the substantive dimension, and in all these three situations, informality flourishes. Also, as you can see on the graph, informality itself can have a feedback loop to the social contract. The greater is informality, the lesser there is trust in the social contract, and the greater is the dissatisfaction with the institutions and with the public services, especially among informal workers. What our latest report is showing is that, moreover, informality also correlates with poor social outcomes. As you can see on these two graphs, the greater there is a share of informality, the greater there is a frequency of the medical treatment deprivation when it is needed, but also the greater is the worry about the education prospects of one's children. In other words, what we see is that in contexts with higher informality, there is also more fragility in a society. Well, social contracts differ across countries and over time. They can also be modified by an array of internal but also external factors. And two such factors, which are the focus of the report that we produced, and which we believe have a very important effect on the social contracts, are globalization and technological change. In what follows, we will speak how these two factors interfere with informality. So first, economic globalization, and Alex will tell you more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Economic globalization, can indeed be a very powerful determinant of economic growth, enhance productivity and efficiency. However, it can also destabilize existing equilibria and power relations between different actors, and with them, the social contract. So in terms of linkages with informality, our analysis shows three important facts. First, we see an asymmetric effect of globalization across countries. So the greater extent of international trade, one of the aspects of globalization, the lower the levels of informal employment in upper middle income and high income countries, but not in lower middle income and low income countries. Second, there is also an asymmetric effect depending on the type of the trade liberalization scenario. So we see, for example, that the expansion of export opportunities boost formal employment opportunities. However, the expansion of imports and import competition can lead to formal employment losses and greater level of informal employment. And third, there is a paramount role that is played by the global value chains through which trade is organized. So all these effects explain in part why informality can remain or even expand with economic growth. At the same time, it's also shows that informality will not permanently decrease on its own, and that it is why policy actions are actually needed. So let's us have a closer look at the links between informality and global value chains. On this graph, we see the share of informal employment on the vertical axis and total GVC participation on the horizontal axis in different sectors of activity. And as we can see in this graph, some sectors have both a very high level of informality and global value chain participation. This is especially the case in the agri-food sector and the textiles. In addition, as is being discussed in the report, the informality footprint of global value chains depends not only on specific sectors of activity, but also on three important factors: the way the production is organized, the purchasing practices, and the possibilities of upgrading within the chain. Now, beside the role of global value chain, digital labor platforms also play an important factor, as Maria will explain.
So yes, indeed, social contracts can also be affected by the technological change. And one of these latest developments is the rise of the digital labor platforms through which the work can be channeled. The digital labor platforms emerged in the beginning of the century as a new way of organizing work. Basically, they can be of two broad types. First, these are online web-based platforms for online delivery of non-material services by a workforce that is potentially scattered around the world. And second, what we have is location-based platforms where basically services are provided by people who are located in the same place as the platform. What our report has shown is that initially, these platforms were heralded as a solution to unemployment problems in many developing countries. However, in reality, the impact on formal employment creation in developing countries is not yet fully grasped and remains very limited so far. This is because often what happens is that the digital labor platforms allow to substitute existing wage employment by services that are delivered by self-employed workers. And very often in developing countries still, these workers often remain unregistered, or in certain cases, they can find themselves in situation of disguised employment relationship. At the same time, as the report has shown, digital labor platforms can provide and do provide a technological opportunity for formalization, because in order to work through them, workers have to register and create accounts on those platforms. So there is an available information about the workers, about the services delivered, and about the work that is channeled through the platforms. However, in order to harness this formalization potential, again, policy solutions and actions on many fronts are still needed. So what are these actions? Well, the report insists indeed that actions on multiple fronts and from multiple actors have to be advanced. First and foremost, we speak about the governments. The governments should have an array of tools that they should be using in order to promote formality and tackle vulnerability of informal workers. These actions include, first of all, the expansion of coverage of formal legal frameworks and social protection, ensuring the sufficient levels of protection, and improving compliance. Basically, if we link this back to the idea of the social contract, this is the improving the procedural dimension of the social contract. Governments also should improve access to and quality of the publicly provided services, such as healthcare, education, and skill development, but also enable the development of formal employment through coordinated policies on labor, social protection, and skills. And basically, this goes to the idea of reinforcing the substantive dimension of the social contracts. As we have seen, there are different factors that affect the social contracts and informality, including globalization and technological change. So to address those, governments should also accompany the global value chain's development by policies regulating subcontracting, promoting due diligence standards, voluntary or obligatory. And regarding the platforms, they should strive to bring digital labor platforms within the scope of existing regulations, but also in certain cases, modernize laws to address the platform's modes of work and also leverage the technologies to formalize. Also, in their turn, multinational enterprises have a role to play. They should strive to promote formal employment in subsidiaries and among suppliers. The lead firms should strive to ensure that the suppliers and subcontractors comply with national labor and social security regulations. Finally, because we're speaking about bringing and making the social contract stronger, we also need informal worker associations, but also civil society organizations, as well as consumers, which should have a voice and should be included into the development of policies that concern them. So with this, we would like to thank you for your attention, and we invite you to read the report where you will find all other details. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I see that our colleague Henri Bernard is back online, so I will actually ask him to moderate this webinar. HB, welcome, and over to you.
Merci beaucoup, Alex. Thank you very much, everyone. We are very happy to have with us an extremely talented panel to comment and give us their first impressions on this landmark report. And I'd like to start straight with you, Philippe Marcadon. You're the Chief of Inclusive Labor Markets, Labor Relations and Working Conditions branch in the ILO. I think everybody knows that the ILO has made important contributions to our report, which is available today. We're very grateful for that. And amongst other things, that contribution shows that the COVID-19 crisis has hit the informal economy workers particularly hard. Actually, you show that informality decreased during the pandemic, but it probably happened for the wrong reasons. They did not move to formal or more decent forms of employment, they just lost their employment. And now what we see is that we're going back to the pre-pandemic levels of informal employment. And so my question is, how can we in the future achieve lasting progress in the creation of formal jobs and in reducing the vulnerability of people who are in informal employment? Philippe. We need you to mute off.
Yes. Thank you, Henri Bernard. Merci. Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting the ILO to participate in this launch. I will. In the ILO, we have a recommendation, that is a recommendation to enforce the international labor standards. It's supposed to guide the way to tackle or to reduce informality, moving toward formalization. We also develop a theory of change that explains the concrete actions that can be taken to move in that direction. But I will not speak so much about that today. We try to highlight and to come back on some of the points highlighted in the report. But before that, to respond to your question, as it was said already by different people, informality is an umbrella term that covers many different situations that have little to do with one because often. And the profile of informality varies strongly among the countries themselves. Informality in Latin America, mostly self-employed, relatively weak institution, low social security coverage, very little to do with informality, the form of informality you find in Europe. So we have the complexity within one country, and we have the difference between countries. So it's issues. So the first thing is that there is no one way to respond to the question raised. The second point, and coming back to the social contract issue, and I am also the coordinator of the activity on the in the ILO. This is why they are here more than my role as the chief of the branch on working condition. So I made a lot of presentation, discussion on informality within the world. What is clear to me is that the tendency is to put the responsibility of informality on people. On people, or because they are low educated, they are suffer from whatever problem of income, or because they are willing to escape to laws and regulation. And this is in most of the cases, so this is true in some cases, but in most of the cases, this is wrong. And I think if you want to tackle informality in general, you should work on two sides. First is to increase the ability of the economy to absorb informal economy workers and enterprise. And we can call that inclusion, including people, but also to strengthen the ability of individuals and enterprise to join the formal economy. We can call that insertion. And it's really working on the two sides that in general you make progress and not working only on one side. This is very much about social contract, because formalization called for the respect of duty and obligation by both the citizen and the state, and it can be seen as contributing to build or rebuild the social contract, or as some have said before, strengthening labor citizenship. That is another way to mention the relation of labor contract. So one important component of the work on reducing informality is to strengthen the inclusiveness, effectiveness, and accountability of labor, of public institutions. And this is very, very, very important. I was social security specialist in Africa during many years. Social security was not delivering any benefit in most of the cases. So why you will join social security system? Now, and intervening on both the capacity of the environment to include and workers to be inserted can be done in different ways. It can be done in national way, for example, or on specific group of workers for enterprise. For example, if you work on enterprise, micro and small enterprise, you should facilitate formalization, registration of enterprise, reducing the economic burden, simplifying rules regarding registration, providing economic incentive for registration. But at the same time, you can work on increasing internal factor of productivity within the enterprise, like skills development, access to technology, changing the management within the enterprise. And this is really this two-side approach that tend to work better, even if we cannot have generalization of what I was saying before. This is the first point. The second point is that formalization is a mean, not an objective. It's a mean for a set of objectives. In the ILO, I would say the first one is access to decent work, but it's only a mean. And for many, they will never formalize, because it means, for what I said before, it means the institution are too weak for not delivering the services. So one of the questions we have in the ILO is, what about what we call reducing decent work deficit of those in the informal economy? Well, what matter is formalization in itself, or is try to improving first the situation of the people, their living condition. And this is, I would say, and ILO is not, it's 187 countries, so it's not I'm speaking as a countries, as a group of countries, not speaking as a particular institution dealing to countries. And the story of how which kind of policies you develop to reduce this work deficit in the informal economy with a perspective, long-term perspective of formalization. In the past, many countries, I would not cite name, have activities to reduce this work deficit in the informal economy without any perspective of formalization in the long term. And this is what in the ILO we don't want. We can consider that reducing this work deficit is the beginning of a process toward a long-term process of formalization, but this should remain at the end the objective. So the story, when we had the discussion in Air 204 in the ILO, one big point was that for constituents, incentive, you cannot give to people in the informal economy all the benefit people have in the formal economy, because if not, you are losing incentive for people to formalize. If I get everything, why I will formalize? So we have a discussion to make about how to help people to live better, and at the same time preserving the incentive to join the formal economy that depend, as I was saying before, strongly about accountability and efficiency of the institution. The third point that I mentioned, will stop after that. That was in the Maria last slide, is about voice and representation. For me, and after having, I work all my life with informal economy workers, if something matters, it's really that to give the people the possibility to express their view, to defend their interests. This is what makes the difference. Yeah. So, well, how we can strengthen, and Laura is with us, and Vigo is working a lot on this aspect, how we can strengthen the capacity of informal economy workers and entrepreneurs to defend their view, to participate in process that concern them directly, because this is what social dialogue should be. And how we can build alliances between more traditional form of employer and worker organizations that have access to the formal social dialogue process. So this is something on which we are working. And with regard to on-account workers that constitute half of informal economy workers, it's also very important to see which kind of organization, social and solidarity economy, for example, that are not only engine for producing better or more, but can be also engine to raise voice and defend collectively interests. Voilà, that's for me. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Philippe. Thank you very much. We expected no less from you and the International Labour Organization than to recall how important it is to have all the major stakeholders around the table. I want to thank you very much for this contribution, but now is the time for me to maybe disrupt a little bit the order of our panel, if you excuse me, because we finally managed to make a connection with our director, Raga. You're calling from Rome in between meetings there, so thank you very much for joining. Dear panelists, if that's okay with you, I know Raga can't stay until the end, so I'd love to have, you know, her quick words before we turn to our next panelist. Raga.
Here. Thank you very much, Aspe, and my deep and sincere apologies to all of you. This sounds very middle-aged to be alone in Rome and not being able to log in, but I understand that there were more people having this problem, so I would say that there was a technical glitch. But I just wanted to make sure that I address you here very briefly. I don't want to stop the conversation, and most of all, just to welcome you and thank all of our partners, our dear partners in this work, because nobody can do a report like this on their own, and this has been a long process dating back to 2009 when we launched the report is Informal Normal. And this has been going. It has been developing since. So I would just like to stress that none of this would have been possible without our valued supporters and interlocutors. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank first the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, represented here today by Anders Gerdin, who I was supposed to give the floor to in the original script, and I am sure that his words were well received. I thank him for supporting this work both financially and also through his extensive feedback. I would also like to thank all of our contributors to the report, especially the experts from the ILO, which helped to ensure that this report is accurate and relevant. And also we are very grateful to our colleagues from other international organizations, those that are with us here today. I mentioned the ILO, the World Bank, and the WTO. And finally, as our report argues, a social contract that addresses informality in a fundamental way cannot be achieved without the participation of informal workers and enterprises. And that's why we are so happy to have representatives of Viego and the Global Reporting Initiative here with us today, and we're counting on you to help us make change possible. So I am again very sorry for this connection problems, and I look forward to hearing about the dynamic discussion that I am sure will be taking place. And I also look forward on behalf of the Development Center on collaborating with you on this important issue in the months and the years to come. So greetings from Rome, and thank you very much, Aspe, for allowing me to take the floor.
No, thank you again. Thank you for your understanding, dear panelists. And I'm now turning to you, Federica Saliola. You're the manager of the jobs groups in the World Bank. And of course, the World Bank has been one of the major actors, both in terms of shaping the thinking, but also the policies in those areas. So we're extremely happy to have you here with us. The report insists on the fact that the social contract is one very useful lens to look at this issue of informality through. It also talks about what the new technologies, such as the digital labor platforms, have introduced in terms of new challenges to those social contracts. And our report shows that there's a lot of potential for these platforms to actually help with the progress of more decent and formal forms of employment, but that we're not there yet. And then in many cases, it's actually more informal jobs that are created. So my questions are the following. To what extent are these findings resonating with your own findings, your own analysis at the World Bank? And how do you find them useful? What do they bring to the discussion that you think can be of use into your own work?
Thank you, Henry. Great question, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. So before I go to your question, I would like to congratulate the OECD colleagues for the report, because I think continue investigating informality and documenting it with more data remains a priority. As we saw, informal employment remains prevalent, especially in developing countries. So as such, enhancing a thorough understanding of its mechanism should remain a priority for all of us, to any evidence-based labor market policy, but also economic policy. So timely, useful, and congratulations. And I see this report certainly be as an input for the World Bank, for our technical work, and for our advisory work. And there is one aspect that I appreciated very much as reading it, which resonates very much with the ongoing work that we are undertaking, which is moving away from the classic one-dimensional view of informality, which is still present in ongoing debate, where we see informal workers as the less educated workers who are unable to find jobs in regular market, and as such are forced to look in informal employment or engage in self-employment. While statistics reveal that reality is way more complex and heterogeneous, as also well documented and shown in this report. There are important differences that we need to take into account if we want to think what are the drivers and how we can address this problem that has been a stubborn problem over the past so many years. So there is, free entry and restricted entry, right? Yeah, informal employment is not always the last resort. If we look at Bangladesh, only 18% of informal employment is involuntary. But also when we look at the wage employment and self-employment, there are huge differences across working condition, compensation mechanisms. And now to add to this complexity, we have this new, category of workers, the gig workers, that are not necessarily informal. They, through digital technology, we can map them, but they face exactly the same issues that informal workers have been facing for several years. So we call this, the fluidity of the market, and we actually see that instead of, developing countries converging in reduced informality, we actually see that as informality remains stubborn in developing countries, now, with the gig work in developed countries, you also have a convergence, but in the opposite direction that we were hoping to get. And so this was documented in our World Development Report 2019. We dedicated the report to this, to the changing nature of work. And we emphasize how, as markets evolve in this way, traditional provision of social protection, become obsolete. And we're currently working on a new job flagship. Well, we document this heterogeneity in 91 countries. So the work done in this report will be a great help for our ongoing work. The idea of informality linked to social contract also aligns with the vision and, with the analysis that the World Bank is doing. We address these linkages again in the 2019 World Development Report and in many subsequent reports. In the report, we show how the old but also new pressure on today's social contract call for new ideas, and the cracks in the current social contract are actually evident precisely in this stubbornly high level of informality, inequality, lack of protection, the changing nature of work due to digital technology. So I'm very pleased to see how this report has made progress in not only in defining the social contract, which, as Maria reminded us, it's a philosophical concept. So not only was defined, but I appreciated how it was nicely linked to informality, the mechanisms. So I think it's very important. And just to leave you with a few more highlights about how much this work aligns with our ongoing work and resonates with our vision, I just would like to mention a few points from a new report that we are about to publish together with our colleagues in the Digital Development Group. So it's the Social Protection and Jobs and Digital Development Group, which is called Working Without Borders: The Promise and the Peril of Online Gig Work. So we also use innovative ideas to measure the presence of digital platforms, which is also nicely addressed in this report, and for which, unfortunately, the reality is that we don't have a lot of data, right? The data is not systematically collected, unlike traditional firms. So the more, I think, the merrier. And in this report that is upcoming, in line with this report, we document the fact that online gig work, it's growing and no longer a negligible part of the labor markets. In some countries, it represents up to 15% of the labor force. So again, with innovative data, we have a limited sample, but when we documented this in the World Development Report, we try at least, it was less than 3%. But today, it grew up almost 5 times in countries. So it is something that it's growing. And as the report shown during COVID-19, clearly there was an acceleration on that. But also, it's no longer a developed country phenomenon, it's becoming very popular in developing countries. And what we noticed that I think is less present in the debate and the analysis is the presence of local gig platforms. And there is, increasing demand from the developing world at the local level. Like a few years ago, digital platforms were mostly in high-income countries. Now we see not only, again, growing regional and local, but we also see those local platforms playing a big role, right? Because not only they tend to cater to the macro, small and medium enterprises, to the startups, often self-employed, single-owned businesses who are looking for gig workers. But also they address a lot of constraints to local private sector development because support small firms and startups. So this is a line of work, of analysis that I think in the coming years, we should develop more and document better because they play, as I said, a big role. And in line with this report, we see that online gig work support the inclusion of the supply side because it provides work opportunities for youth, women, and relatively low-skilled workers. And also in areas where local jobs are not sufficiently present, and also might widen the talent pool for the micro enterprises, for the small enterprises on the demand side. But at the same time, a lot of people are still without internet access, like what we call the digital divide remains wide. And that's key to address this problem. In the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, there is a wide presence of digital platforms, but digital payments are not enhanced. So that limits. I myself took Uber and I had to pay cash. So that limits significantly not only the ability to change, right, the share of informality or to influence that, but also for them to expand the business. And I know I don't have a lot of time, so I just would like to leave you with a message that in line with this report, we think government can use the promise of the gig economy. They can increase earning opportunities. We can engage with platforms to increase social protection, coverage for informal workers, but we also need to, build safeguards against the peril and protect the gig workers through, also modern forms of social protection and collective bargaining. So full alignment, a lot of synergies, great inputs, and I hope more collaboration in the future with the OECD team. Over to you, Henri, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Federica. That's extremely helpful. Now it's time for me to turn to you, Laura. Laura Alfers, you're the director of the Social Protection Program at Women and Informal Employment, WIGO. We go a long way, actually, in our collaboration, and we're very happy to have you here with us. You're not going to be surprised that I want to ask you about informal workers and how to include them in policy making. That's one of the strong messages of this report, which also calls for rendering the social contracts more relevant and fair to informal workers. So I think Federica recalled it. This whole notion of social contract, is kind of complex because the informal sector or the informal economy itself is complex. So my question to you is, what does it mean in concrete terms? How does that vision help? And what do you think that the report can contribute to your organization who's trying to work towards a better inclusion of informal workers? How does it all work in the real world?
Thanks, Henri, and very good to be here. So, I think it's probably important just to backtrack a bit and to be clear on why it's important for inclusion in sort of rulemaking, to include informal workers themselves in rulemaking and sort of policy setting processes. And if voices are not heard, if the voices of informal workers are not heard through active participation, it does mean that their needs are less likely to be taken into account by law and policy. And we continue to see this gap between the substantive and the procedural dimensions of the social contract, as we saw in Maria and Alexander's presentation earlier. So we remain in a situation, and I think it's also worth emphasizing that, yes, there is complexity in formality for sure, but informal workers, in general make up over 60% of the working population in the world. And so we end up in a situation where the majority of the world's workers remain outside of protections and positive supports that the state has to offer, or they're offered supports that are not suited to the realities, right? So, there's often this idea that informal workers are excluded out of regulation, but quite often we see that they're included in regulation, but on adverse terms, right? On terms that are quite negative and which ultimately undermine livelihoods. And then I also think it's important just to emphasize the real knock-on effects that we see from this. You have so many of the world's productive people excluded from forms of protection and support for their productive activities. It's going to have damaging effects on society as a whole. Poverty, informal workers face lower incomes and greater financial risk. So without protections and productive supports, you find that, they will find it very difficult to work their way out of poverty. We saw this during COVID, increases in poverty. Many of those people are informal workers who, without protections, fall into poverty. Then we have the economic impacts. When the right protections and supports are put into place for informal workers, you have people with higher incomes. There is more money which circulates in the economy. This fuels the growth of businesses, which in turn can hire more people. You may increase levels of tax revenue. And of course, the opposite is also true when supports and productive sort of support for informal workers is not there. And then there's also the issue of human development incomes. You know, decent work provides a means by which to participate in society with security and a sense of dignity. Much informal work doesn't have that. It's degrading, it operates in hazardous environments, incomes are too low. And so society as a whole doesn't get the benefits of you know, what work can bring to society as a whole. And I think that's why the vision of this report is so important. It's real emphasis on the inclusion of informal workers to both help workers themselves, but also to increase a whole set of positive knock-on effects for society as a whole by ensuring inclusion of informal workers. And I think that's a really important point, which I'll come back to. I think in terms of actually including informal workers into, I mean, I think Philippe mentioned in his talk that, you know, we need to provide space for workers in collective dialogue spaces, social dialogue spaces, formal dialogue spaces. Quite often those dialogue spaces legally exclude many informal workers because the employment relationship isn't there, which leads on to a whole sort of knock-on effects around organization. But we also need to make sure that informal workers are able to exercise voice effectively, right? So, and that's, I think, where the really hard work often comes in. We need to locate the organizations and we need to help facilitate the building of organizations of workers in the informal economy, which sometimes isn't that simple because informal workers are not organized in the same way that formal, you know, in terms of the actual work process and work location and how work happens. And then it's about building technical expertise as well, you know, so there's the space, but if informal workers go into the space and have no sort of real critical sense of what they're being asked to speak about, you know, participation is less meaningful. So that backup technical support is really important. Supporting and critical analysis of the policy proposals that are on the table or the legal proposals that are on the table. And also the really critical point around alliance building. So it may be with trade unions in order to get access, or, you know, employer organizations as a way in which to get access to social dialogue spaces. But it may be in different ways as well. Other civil society organizations, depending on what the issue is. And yeah, I think so. You know, we talk about needing to have informal workers participate in policy processes. It's not just about opening up the space, right? It's about supporting organizations. It's about capacity building, transfers of knowledge, alliance building, and all of these critical things. And I think that often gets overlooked as the kind of day-to-day grind work, but is so important if we are truly going to have informal workers being able to input meaningfully into these processes. Yeah, and just again to say that this I mean, for me, in reading the report, this very clear articulation of the divide between procedural dimensions of the social contract, the sort of formal institutions, the formal rules and regulations that make up the formal social contract, and the divide between that and the substantive reality of work as it actually happens in reality, and the realities of the state that informal workers actually face, and the kinds of relationships that are developed around informal work. The divide between those two is really important, and I really enjoy the way the report has so clearly articulated that divide, and really making the point that in order for a social contract to be built, we need to narrow that gap. And the way we narrow that gap is, of course, through dialogue and through collective forms of organization and inputting into those policy processes. Thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Laura. And to those of you who haven't yet read the report, you contributed a very powerful preface to our report. So thank you for that as well. And I invite everyone to read this and also the other parts of the report, which is now available on our website. Now turning to our next speaker, Mark Bacchetta, you're a Chief of Section of Economic Research and Statistics Division in the World Trade Organization, and we're extremely happy to have you here with us. The report, of course, talks a lot about globalization, that's its big focus. And it sort of shows, and with figures, that the hopes that we place on globalization to try and solve the issue of social inclusion through jobs in particular in poor countries, are not completely met. There are positive changes, mostly concentrated in the higher end of the categories of revenues of countries, but for workers in the informal economy of lower middle income countries, the evidence does not establish that globalization has created an improvement for them. And global value chains in many sectors like agriculture, garments, still carry a high footprint of informality. So my questions are the following. In your view, what recommendations are the report? First, do you agree with them? And which ones do you think can help put us on the better track to ensure that the benefits of globalization accrue to the poorest countries and to the poorest in countries, and make sure also that global value chains actually come up with formal, decent job creation for both men and women, and not just more informal job creation?
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you all for inviting me to this launch and for giving me an opportunity to read and to comment on this report, which I find I find really interesting. My perspective I realize will be a bit different from the one of the other panelists, because I'm really coming from the trade and more from the globalization side, and I have a sort of a bit of a more macro approach. But let me try. So before I turn to the policy recommendations and give you and respond to your precise question, just allow me to say a few words about how globalization and trade have affected the poorest countries and the poor who live in those countries. In the late 90s and early 2000, a period which is now known as hyperglobalization, which coincided with the emergence of global value chains, world exports accelerated dramatically. We know that. During this period, expressing country income groups in time invariant categories, the share of low-income countries in world trade increased from 2.8% to 16.7% of world trade, the largest growth of any income group. Clearly, China, categorized as a low-income country in 1985, was a major driver of these shifts. But many other developing countries also saw their share in world exports increase during this period of hyperglobalization. Data from the World Bank show that these changes in openness and trade coincided with a very sharp decline in poverty across most regions. In the 90s and 2000s, enormous progress was made on the global goal of eliminating extreme poverty. Importantly, the most dramatic decreases in poverty took place in East Asia and the Pacific. In fact, most of it can be attributed to China, where approximately 1 billion people escaped poverty in recent decades. There are good reasons to believe that China's increased openness to trade during this period and its export-driven economic growth model made an important contribution to this progress. But other countries which also embraced globalization, from Korea and Vietnam to Eastern Europe, experienced large and rapid poverty reductions. This link between openness and poverty reduction is also reflected in the fact that the one region that has not seen equivalent progress in recent decades is Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the world's least integrated regions, where huge shares of the continent's population are completely disconnected from global markets. At the same time, the number of poor people living in Sub-Saharan Africa has been more or less stagnant since the 1990s. Today, the majority of the world's poor actually live in Sub-Saharan Africa, and most economic projections suggest that this trend will only continue in future years. With this background, the question, in my view, how to help ensure that the benefits from globalization accrue to the poorest countries can be sort of rephrased into, first, how to help the poorest countries actually participate more actively in trade and GVCs. And second, the question that is closer to what the one you are asking, which is how to make their participation in trade and GVCs, the participation of those poorest countries, more inclusive. Just a few words on the first question. Strengthening the participation of the poorest countries in trade and GVCs generally involves diversifying their exports, which has been difficult. The bank, many others, the governments all have tried, and it is difficult. In Africa, significant investments in transportation and communication infrastructure, including notable efforts by China and the establishment of an African continental free trade area, are encouraging developments. Given the present context of deglobalization and waning multilateralism, a regionally focused trade integration may indeed be the more realistic approach. If, however, multilateralism can be revived, deeper economic integration, including with richer countries, could generate larger gains. Digital and services trade, for example, hold promises, even if this would require significant investment in relevant infrastructure and institutions. Just a quick second point, importantly, as explained in the report, the higher degree of informality in a country may in fact preclude it from greater participation in the global economy. And a comprehensive effort to reinvigorate social contracts could help reducing informality and boost inclusive participation. Let me now turn to the second question, how to mitigate the adverse effects of trade and to ensure that its benefits are shared on a more equitable basis, which is close to the one which is addressed in the report. The focus in the report is on the impact of trade on the informal economy, which, as indicated, cannot be separated from its impact on employment in general. In the policy discussion, the report points out that trade liberalization should be accompanied by appropriate passive and active labor market policies. It rightly emphasizes the need to design such programs with a special focus on the most affected regions. And this is indeed very important, as experience has shown that the effects of trade vary considerably by region and that interregional labor mobility is relatively limited. The report also insists on the importance of skill policies, and in particular vocational training for adult learners, lifelong learning targeting skill changes arising from globalization, or skill recognition policies. To address more specifically the fact that formal firms may hire informal workers after trade liberalization, the report recommends effective labor inspection and enforcement of current regulations. Skill and skill-related policies play an important role in helping trade adjustment, and the report usefully spells out why they are particularly important for informal workers. Recognizing that governments are not the only actors responsible for addressing the deficiencies in the social contracts, the report further highlights the role of businesses, as well as the role of consumers, informal worker associations, and NGOs. It specifically discusses the recommendations spelled out in the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct to help enterprises implement the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises that are particularly relevant with regard to informal employment. I'm wondering, and it's a question really, whether there is any evidence on how effective actually the OECD and the other international frameworks are in actually promoting better working conditions. The report finally stresses that strengthening the voice and the bargaining power of informal workers and encouraging sector-specific approaches to informality are key, and we definitely take note of this. To conclude, I would like to mention that another very important channel, besides the labor market, through which trade and GVC participation affect the distribution of the gains from trade, is the price and consumption channel. Existing evidence on the distribution of the gains from lower prices brought about by trade between different firms and different groups of consumers is mixed and inconclusive. There is evidence that many firms, instead of passing the cost reductions they experienced from tariff reductions onto their customers in the form of lower prices on a one-for-one basis, instead chose to increase their profit margins. As a result, the average prices facing consumers declined, but not by as much as the average cost declines. It would be important to take into account this channel when designing strategies to address the effect of trade and GVCs on informal workers and firms. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup, Marc. Thank you for these very interesting insights. And as you say, you come from a different angle, but that's the whole point of this panel, is really to try and multiply the angles. The key, for me, the key takeaway of the report is that fixing the social contract isn't the job of any particular line ministry. And when we keep saying that everyone has an important role to play, the big looming question, and maybe I'll come back to that as a conclusion after our last speaker on the panel, is, well, if it's everyone's job, there's probably a risk that in the end it's nobody's job. So how do we fix that? How do we make sure that if all the different policy communities have to find new ways of collaborating together, what is going to create the incentives for them to actually do that, right? Because obviously we don't have that yet. So thanks again for coming from the point of view of the World Trade Organization and your macroeconomist point of view. And now let me turn to our final, but certainly not least, panelist, Astildor Hjaltadottir. You are the Chief Sustainability Officer of Global Reporting Initiative. You spent your whole career helping multinational companies conduct responsible business socially. And here, of course, the report stresses their role, in tackling informal employment and reducing the vulnerability of people in informal employment. So my questions are the following. In your view, to what extent do multinational enterprises see this problem? How aware are they of the problems that informal employment creates, not just for the informal workers, but as we heard from the presentation, for the economy as a whole, and ultimately probably for their own businesses? And then the second question is, looking at the various recommendations of the report, do you see any of them that can be operationalized by enterprises so as to address the informality issue and help create more responsible business conduct towards formal job creation by enterprises?
Thank you so much for the questions, and thank you for inviting GRI to be here today, and big congratulations to you all on a very, very elaborate and very insightful report, which I have browsed through with, or read through actually, with great interest. And yeah, so GRI obviously develops sustainability reporting standards. And the standards are or organized or developed in such a way that they are actually can be used by organizations or companies of all size, and regardless of their geographic location, sector, etc. But I think it's safe to say that the main uptake over time has obviously been from the larger companies. And I think this has become a mainstream practice amongst definitely all MNEs, multinational enterprises. So they will all be reporting on their sustainability impacts for sure. And it's important to keep in mind that the sort of two key elements of the reporting are transparency and accountability. And this, of course, also brings with it that the MNEs, they should, or probably also want to, be accountable for their supply chains, or the global value chains, as we are referring to them in the report. So I'm just sort of mixing your questions up a little bit. I hope that's okay. So because I was thinking about the two recommendations, that they were actually already mentioned by Maria already in the beginning. It's the one that was quite early on in the report about the lead firms striving to ensure that suppliers and subcontractors disclose details of contracting further or their arrangement, and obviously that all these contracts or arrangements are in compliance with national legislations. I think that's absolutely extremely important. And then also another one that came later on in the report, and I think it was in the section mainly mentioned in the section on the digital platforms, is due diligence. And I think these two are very closely aligned. And because if you want, as a large company with a complicated supply chain, which I think is the case for most of these MNEs, and we also see that in the report, you know, for instance, in the agricultural sector, this is just, there are so many different layers, and the tendency seems to be to outsource rather than keep ownership of the different tiers in the supply chain. So that means that the MNE themselves, or the large buyer, is sometimes quite far removed from the lower level in their supply chain. So, but that doesn't mean that there is nothing that they can do, because there is a lot that they can do by demanding or requesting this type of information that is mentioned in that recommendation. But I would like to emphasize, though, that it's very important that this does not turn into a compliance exercise. You know, that people just feel that they have to do something. And so there are actually two sides to this. And the incentive was also mentioned by one of the panelists. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that we need to convince those who have to provide the information or change the way that they work and take all the other levels in the supply chain into account, that they need to understand that this is for a reason. It's not just to tick some box and send some documentation up to the largest buyer, the entry point of the chain, but this actually is for the greater good. And at GRI, we have actually been working quite a lot in developing countries through programs that are funded, for instance, by SIDA, in making the link between the large buyers and the suppliers in the supply chain, whether those are SMEs or other type of suppliers, so that we're trying to get the MNEs to take on this sort of mentorship role and that helps them, show that they are not just focusing on responsible business conduct in their own operations, but actually also taking accountability and responsibility of how their products are produced. And that sort of brings me then back to the due diligence part. Very recently, we updated part of our standards that are the universal standards, that are the part that are applicable to all organizations that report according to GRI. And then, of course, you have topic standards and sector standards that are more relevant to your actual line of business or operations. And when taking these, when updating the standards, then they have been fully aligned with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And they're also referencing all other relevant instruments like the OECD, MNE guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. So that is sort of back to the question that somebody was raising. To what extent have these instruments actually been promoted? I think by sort of integrating them or aligning them in the GRI standards that are used by all these multinationals, that we can at least say that quite a lot has been achieved in that way. So I think the way that the standards are now written is that as part of your materiality assessment to identify what are the most, where your biggest impact is, then you are also requested to do a due diligence sort of assessment as well. And this hopefully helps or encourages multinationals to also take responsibility further down their chain of production, because like like has been mentioned, they are not necessarily, or rather unlikely, in direct relationship with the lower tiers. But when it comes to the informal workers themselves, because they are informal and they are not well organized, etc., then I think the associations of those workers, they become crucial, as to Laura's point, to help them raise their voice or be present in the whole ecosystem of this relationship within the global value chain. So I think it's always going to be difficult to engage with the informal workers themselves, but these types of organizations, like also Viego is of course a good representative of that, lobbying on their behalf, will be very or continue to be key players in strengthening their position in the global value chains. Those are sort of the things that come to my mind. Of course, there are lots of other triggers that from this report that we could discuss. I found it extremely interesting, and I also really like the way that it was structured. It enabled you to focus on a sort of a different aspect of the issue. So again, great report. Encourage everyone to read it.
Thank you very much, Estelle. This is extremely helpful, and we are glad you were able to bring that, again, complementary angle of the role of multinational enterprises. Again, one of the major contributions of the report, or at least conclusions, is the dire need to get the different actors to work together. So before I turn to our Deputy Director, Ayumi Yuasa, to send us on our way at the end of this webinar, let me take the couple of minutes we have left to turn back to our panelists and ask all of you if there's anything at the end of this discussion that you'd like to add in terms of the follow-up, in terms of how you wish that different actors would seize their role and work differently together or separately to try and mend some of these issues. We've heard a lot of recommendations already about due diligence, about more regulation, but is there anything you'd like to add for policymakers in particular that you would say are the priority actions to be taken at this stage? Philippe?
Yeah. Not just two points very quickly. The first one is that due diligence is nice, and we discussed it, I remember, in one of the seminars, but you have also risk attached to due diligence, compulsory due diligence. In particular, some companies have the tendency to exclude some workers that are informal, home-based workers, to avoid to have any contentious problems. So the idea is really not to exclude people, because home-based workers are women that offer not other alternative to have an income and to gain autonomy. So we should be cautious that we should move toward progress and not excluding people. And I think most of the discussion is about inclusion. I just also want to say, and it's more an information issue, that the ILO, the 187 member of the ILO, will adopt, in principle, an international labor standard on decent work in the platform economy, where informality is one of the key topics.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Federica.
Yes, thank you, Henry. So a lot has been said already. What I would like to add to the discussion or remind ourselves is the importance of data, and make sure that the policies are evidence-based for the following reasons, right? I think the report shows nicely, and that informality is associated with underdevelopment more broadly. I like all those scattered plots that they show at the beginning that looks at the medical expenses, education, and there is wide heterogeneity in informal activities. So in the end, addressing informality is a development agenda, and is the jobs agenda. We know that the bottleneck is that is the difficulty to create better jobs, better quality jobs, more productive jobs that requires structural transformation, right? We know that there are several dimensions that need to come together for the creation of better jobs, which is one of the probably most unmet agendas in developing countries. So to do that, I think from the discussion, it's clear that we need comprehensive reform package. It's not just addressing, one entry point. In fact, that hasn't worked in addressing informality. Like you might look at trade policies, you might look at how multinational companies are treated in the country. It could be a matter of regulations, but we also need tailored reform package. And that really requires, understanding the context, analyzing carefully, monitoring it, because the bottlenecks and the binding constraints are very different from one country to the other. So without good data, which also call for more collaboration among our institutions, we want to achieve this. Because again, creating better jobs, it can be a last resort or something that we think will be coming automatically. It needs to be thought ex ante, incorporated in the design of the policies, and more importantly, monitoring it, because as we see, labor markets evolve very rapidly. So since this is a development agenda, jobs agenda, again, I would like to remind ourselves the importance of data, evidence-based policy making, and collaboration among key stakeholders in the development world. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Federica. There's certainly one thing we can take away from how we describe the informal economy is how multifaceted and complex it is. And you're right. It's very easy to get carried away by a vision we want to have for all sorts of reasons of that economy. And so evidence has to be the only way we look at it. I'll turn to Laura, then I can't help but ask Anders if he has any reactions afterwards, and then we'll turn to Ayumi to close the meeting. Laura.
Thank you, Henri. I suppose just a point to the sort of multiple actors that are always involved in policy making, just to ensure that even if formal social dialogue does not necessarily include workers in the informal economy, efforts should be made towards consultation of the organizations in the informal economy that do exist. So, if, and this can go across multiple actors, from the people who are producing the data, for example, are we sense checking that with organizations of informal economy workers as well? Are we talking to informal economy worker organizations about what kind of data is important for them to be able to put across their points? If you are sort of making the policy and developing the programs, are there ways that you can consult with organizations of informal workers and sense check the design issues or whatever it is that needs to be solved? If you're coming from a trade union perspective for a civil society organization working on an issue which is going to affect workers in the informal economy, to what extent are you trying to engage with organizations that do exist and trying to sense check your proposals against those and drawing them into the processes that you have access to? So it's really just to say that across all the sort of elements of policy making that are important, it would be great to see more inclusion of organizations of informal workers. Thank you.
Merci, Laura. And Anders, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't want to leave you also out if you have any reactions to what you just heard today.
Yeah, I think it's been a very valuable discussion. Something that we might miss slightly is the issue of regarding the informal workers as valuable resources that could merit further investments to integrate them into a formal setting. I think it's fairly easy to be caught up in trying to figure out what the informal workers should do to be formalized. But on the other hand, there's a need to have a discussion on how governments and countries want to involve them in more productive settings and how to arrange that. Because if you have a country with, let's say, 80 to 90% of informal economy, if you can increase the income of these people by a fraction, it would make a dramatic increase in GDP and so on. So I think it's important to have that dual view. It's not only what the informal workers should do to be formalized, but how we should involve them into a formal setting. Thank you.
Very useful, Anders. Thank you very much. Yes, everybody stands to win. It's been a very enjoyable discussion. I want to thank our panelists very much, as well as everybody in the audience. And now, Ayumi, you're the Deputy Director of the OECD Development Centre. The floor is yours to wrap it up.
Thank you, Ashbey. So dear colleagues, dear panelists and participants, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for making this launch event such a success. For me, as someone who has been working in development agenda for 25 years, I have personally witnessed the importance of work on informality, and I'm sure that you all agree that today's discussion further highlighted the significance. Our conversation has been fruitful, and we have contributed to a better understanding of the consequences of globalization and technological change for informal workers. We have also engaged with a new vision of informality, one that reflects the social contract in any society. We have seen that formalization will not happen on its own. If no specific policies are put in place, driving forces will make informality revert to the status quo. Thus, creating such policies and making them work requires a joint effort between the public and private sectors with the participation of informal workers and their representatives. A culture change with enhanced trust between all actors is also needed. Therefore, I would like to express my appreciation to our partners from international organizations, donor agencies, businesses, and organizations representing informal workers for joining us today. Each of these actors plays an essential role in implementing legal frameworks and due diligence practices and in developing new initiatives to better protect workers. This launch is just the beginning of our work on informal employment here at the OECD Development Centre. Our objective is to use this report as a tool to provide solid policy advice to our member countries and to continue a constructive dialogue with our public and private sector partners. Now, what happens next? The findings of this report will feed our forthcoming country consultations, such as inclusive productive transformation in Asia and the vulnerability challenges in the informal economy. The results may also inform ongoing discussions at the European and international level on digital labor platforms. We are also already working on the next report, which will focus on the working conditions and well-being of informal economic workers and their families. So knowledge gaps persist in such areas as transitions to formality, as Anders mentioned, and skill development for informal workers and their children, and also tools to improve social protection. So therefore, our action is needed, and we will publish this new report near the end of this year. So stay tuned. Finally, I want to acknowledge and thank everyone who made this report possible, including my colleagues at the OECD Development Centre and across the OECD, the contributors to the report, and external experts with whom we consulted. We hope that everyone here today will use the report's messages to advance the formalization agenda so that together we can move toward stronger and fairer society for all. Let us keep up the good work and continue this constructive dialogue. Thank you and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Au revoir,
Bye-bye.
merci.